All right, next I'd like to bring up Kevin Psyche. I always mispronounce his name, do I not?
That's all right.
Yeah, and there's an interesting segue in regards to CenturyLink, correct?
That's correct. I was reading over the notes this morning. I was excited about coming to the event and couldn't help but notice that Omaha is one of our first communities that we're going to be building fiber to every home and business, and as one of our initiatives to bring the latest technology to businesses and customers, consumer customers in that area. So I was pretty pumped up when I knew we were going to be talking to somebody from Omaha. The other part of this is that we're really proud to be part of this. One of the things that CenturyLink provides as part of our acquisition of Savvis is, and I apologize, thought I was going to be a little bit more prepared, but with Savvis we bring a scalable software as a service, a platform as a service, and an infrastructure as a service. So as you're starting up your business and you don't have the capital that's been mentioned several times today, you can reach out to us and we can provide some of those tools that will help build your business at a very low cost because it's extremely scalable. And if you just go check out Savvis Direct, we'd love for you to come and talk to us as well. So my job is to introduce Matt. Matt's story is pretty interesting. Matt is a professional speaker, blogger, consultant, founder of Stanford and Griggs, LLC. While getting his undergraduate management information system from the University of Minnesota Carlson School of Management, Matt first stepped into the forefront of internet technology, pioneering one of the school's first web servers. Since then, Matt joined Best Buy, where he served as the Director of Innovation Development. In the role, Matt learned that failure has an undeniable part of innovation process, and what wisdom is a valuable commodity gained in failure. While at Best Buy, Matt created the failure forums to capture the wisdom and lessons learned through the innovation initiatives. Now Matt works as a consultant, helping organizations with innovation, leadership, and business strategy. Please welcome Matt.
How are you, Matt?
All right. So I'm told the slides are going to pop up briefly, but I think the audience online will see them. So I'm going to make sure we're kind of on the same page.
Yeah, let's test to make sure. I believe they are up as we speak.
Okay.
Adrian, you good to go? You're good to go.
Great. So again, my name's Matt Hunt. I had spent, you guys are all entrepreneurs. I am an entrepreneur wannabe, just recently back in the business. 20 years ago, I was a web developer, getting small businesses online with HTML and a lot less tools than what you guys have today. But I spent my last 15 years after B school in corporate America. I spent almost 7 years with Morgan Stanley building an IT outsourcing practice, and I spent the last 8.5 years with Best Buy, mostly around the innovation and business development work. So back into entrepreneurship and figuring it out along the way, and got some great ideas already to take home. So fear, failure, entrepreneurship. Fear, failure, entrepreneurship. Have you ever had a conversation with somebody about, and by the way, Sarah, great presentation this morning, great sort of reality check on this is scary stuff sometimes, but have you ever seen somebody talk about failure and they recoil? You see that emotion literally run through them, that fear that gets created when we think about failure in our own lives. That failure, or that fear, is actually totally normal. We just need to recognize that that's totally normal, and we need to say we can maybe do something about it. That fear is what got us off of the African savannah here to Columbia, Missouri. It's that fear that got us and moved us forward. So one of the things that I try to talk about is, if fear is what got us to survive those times, how do we then capture that fear and manage that fear? I think we need to manage our fear of failure if we're going to survive being an entrepreneur. And it's that premise that sort of drives the thinking that I've seen in both corporate America as well as with the entrepreneurs that I work with. Some speakers come up and they'll give you 7 steps and 9 tips. I got 3. I got 3 fears that we're going to talk about that If we actually understand them, we can address them. I'm going to talk about 3 different cultural perspectives on failure, and I'm going to talk about 3 ways where we can maybe change our own perspective on failure and supporting others. All right, so quick survey. I saw some hands raising earlier. How many of you are entrepreneurs today? Okay, and how many of you are aspiring entrepreneurs? Okay, and then how many of you have a nice cushy job, but someday you think in an office where you think you might want to someday be an entrepreneur? Okay, a few of those. All right, so we've got lots of entrepreneurs. I want you to think about that one entrepreneurial idea you have. Oh, there we go, the smiles, the cracks. You're entrepreneurs. You don't have one idea. You've got 100 ideas. Okay, now think about that one fear that you have of being a failed entrepreneur. Oh, I see some more smiles. Okay, you're an entrepreneur. You don't have one fear of failure. You have 1,000 fears of failure. I want you to take those 1,000 fears and just capture them, if you can. Put them in your stomach. Let them marinate in there for a little while. Because those fears are what actually will affect our perspective on what happens when we do fail. And we'll talk about them a little bit later. And maybe. There we go. Okay. Columbia, Missouri. The Athens of Missouri. I got to tell you, when I read that, I loved it. True story, in 6th grade, I said I wanted to be a philosopher. I even had my first revelation. You ready for it? Nothing is nothing, but nothing is something to talk about. Profound, right? Prophetic. I mean, and this was before Seinfeld, talking about nothing. So I had my grand vision. I was gonna be a philosopher. And then my girlfriend's father pointed out this simple fact: philosophers don't make any money. Oh, hadn't thought about that part, right? You got to have a revenue stream. You got ideas. You got to have a revenue stream behind them. Didn't have a revenue stream behind it, and so what did I do? I tabled that idea. I put it on the shelf. I walked away from it, and I moved on. I went towards where I thought I needed to go. So fast forward, or taking a look today at my time then, and sort of replaying that, I pushed the idea aside, but I actually, when it was mentioned that I have an undergraduate in management information systems, my minor was in philosophy. Well, sort of philosophy. I covered it up. I called it business ethics because I didn't know how it would look on the resume as philosophy. And then when I took my MBA, I went for strategic management. I always gravitated towards those big ideas, those big problems. And then fast forward 20 years. I've now sort of pushed my 20-year career in corporate America to the side, and I'm again looking for those big ideas, those big obstacles that need to be addressed. And for me, the topic of failure is that obstacle. Interestingly enough, when I look back at that history and I think of philosopher versus entrepreneur, there's actually a lot of similarity. Philosophers are looking for the big idea. They're looking for the big problem. Entrepreneurs, looking for that big idea, that big problem. The only difference, entrepreneurs actually do something about it instead of just talk about it. So kudos to you, entrepreneurs, who are doing something about your ideas. Okay, so go to the next. All right, so let's talk about those fears. What held me back at that time when I made the decision not to be the philosopher? It was that fear of failure, or fear of not having money, fear of being the poor failure. Entrepreneurs that I talk to, entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs, both cite that fear of failure is what had held them back. Maybe not forever, but it held them back. They didn't jump in right away. They didn't follow that passion. They didn't follow that dream. If you look at the fears that I'm going to talk about, it's the fear of economic failure, the fear of loss of friends, family potentially, fear of self-esteem. This is the one Sarah was talking about, confidence, the respect that people want. If you look at those fears, they actually line up really well with the center of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. The need for safety, in this case financial safety. The need for belief and belonging, and that is friends and family. And then lastly, the need for self-esteem. We all have those needs. And when you fail at being an entrepreneur, you are risking, right? You are risking all of those vital needs that we all have. So it's a scary attempt. And so we say, oh, I'm not going to be an entrepreneur this week, or I'm not going to be an entrepreneur this year. I've got small kids, I've got a mortgage, I've got all of these things. But if you look at it, these fears, most of them are very relative. Your fear of economic failure, think about it when you were a college student. Rent, beer money, ramen noodles, right? You didn't have a lot that you needed. Now maybe you do. But it was a relative measure. You might have been more willing to take risk in those early days. The loss of family and friends, the loss of self-esteem, that is absolutely a relative term. The idea that we in the United States have a different culture, a different perspective on those failures as someone in Central America, Latin America, Europe, Asia, it's different. It's different for every culture. So one of the things I do want to talk about is the money piece, because I think, while it may be somewhat relative from our early days to our later in our careers, there's actually some great advice. One of my favorite modern day philosophers, Nassim Taleb, in his book The Black Swan, talks about it as the FU money. I talk about it as my walk away money. That money that you might put away on the side to say, you know what, if this isn't working out, if I have to call it quits, I am not going to necessarily go into my second mortgage. I am going to walk away, and I'm going to be okay. I've seen that used. It's one of those ways, it's one way you can address that fear of economic failure that might get you started today. It will take you a little time. You'll need to build that nest egg up. You'll need to build that walk-away money up, but it is an option. So let's talk about the other perspectives on failure. The ones that I'm saying are more relative. Loss of family, loss of friends, loss of self-esteem. So I want to talk to you about, they flash up there briefly. Oh, you can see it on this slide. Colombia, South America. We're going to talk about Gujarat is a state in India. And I want to talk about Silicon Valley. Can't talk about innovation and failure without Silicon Valley. Each of them has a unique lesson, and back to that point, they're relative. So I want to make sure we're understanding that we have opportunities in our society where failure is tolerated. Let's start with Colombia, South America. Anyone else believe in serendipity, by the way? Anyone, raise your hand if you do. I was working on this presentation a couple weeks ago, and a friend of mine who had been at the University of Minnesota together with me reached out to me and was talking about her perspective on failure in Colombia, South America. Columbia, Missouri, Columbia, South America. I thought it was, whoa. They believe in serendipity too. So Colombia, South America, and I'm just, if I go to the next slide. Maybe? Okay. In Colombia, South America, my friend's been down there for a couple of years now working with entrepreneurs and startups. And her perspective, her reality is that failure is a permanent stain on your record. Permanent. You fail, everyone knows it, everyone remembers it. In my corporate days, we used to call it the scarlet letter F, right? Walk around the campus with your scarlet letter F. But the unique thing is they think this, they know that this is the case, But they also understand that there's variations in society. So when these entrepreneurs are creating their pitch decks for Latin American investors, that pitch deck has a failure-free model. Don't mention it, don't talk about it, it's not going to happen. But when they pitch to US investors, they have their failure included deck. Oh, we've got gray hairs, we've been around the block, we know business, we've been there before. We're willing to talk about that this thing might not succeed. The reality, though, for many of them is that failure is not an option. They believe that if you have prepared well enough, you have the right network of investors, you have the right influential friends, that you should be able to avoid failure at all costs. Now, compare that to the state of Gujarat in India. A friend of mine told me this story a few months back, and I've actually been able to verify it with so moving on. There we go, Gujarat, India, thank you. Have been able to verify it. Gujarat, 5,000-year-old history, 5,000 BC. They have 60 million people today. They have very, very poor natural resources. So they became entrepreneurs by necessity. They had a long coastline along the Arabian Sea, and that coastline allowed them to trade, sea and shipping trade. And so they would do whatever they could. And then once they found something, though, they would repeat it over and over and over again. Gujarat's known for pharmaceuticals, textiles, plastics, you name it, they got it. But the most interesting thing is not all of these accolades about how well their economy has grown, how well they've done. It's that when two entrepreneurs from Gujarat meet each other, they realize that they're from the same area, and they start off the conversation. They start off the conversation with, what are your failures? And they rattle them off. And it could go on for days, apparently. This is what I tried, this is what I tried. I tried this. Whether it's flower shops in Africa or storefronts in Europe, they are boastful. They are boastful about their failures. They like their successes, they're proud of their successes, but they're willing to step up and say, you know what? These are all the things I tried, and these didn't work. Think about that for a second. Think about American society. We get up, we puff out our chest, look at me, look what I've done, look at all my successes. No. You start out by saying, look at all my failures. Think of how tolerant, think of our perspective on what failure means if we were to take that approach. And then finally, Silicon Valley. So our classic example, you don't have to go to India to find a sliver of this. We've got it in Silicon Valley. Trial and error entrepreneurship. Randy Komisar, author of Getting to Plan B, had a great quote from a few years ago. He said, what makes Silicon Valley unique is not our long list of successes. It is how we deal with failure. Right? How we deal with failure. He knows innovation is, you guys all know this, innovation is a numbers game. We're not going to bat 500. We're not going to bat 1,000. We're going to bat 300. We're going to bat 100. The Wall Street Journal had an article recently, 3 out of 4 VC-invested startups fail. If you look at, and that's fail like, hey, we lost all your money. If you look at the percentage of those startups that don't actually hit their targets, don't hit either ROI or the return on capital, it goes to 95%. 95% startups fail. So again, if we are going to get into this, let's actually understand the place that does it best is okay with those odds. They deal with those odds. That is their mental perspective. Right? I want to share a quick story. In my time at one of the largest consumer electronics companies in the nation, out of Minneapolis, you might be able to figure out who it is. I had a lot of opportunities to deal with Silicon Valley entrepreneurs, and one of them that I really enjoyed was Anthony Wood. He started the company called Roku. Any Japanese speakers in the audience? Roku? Number 6. Anthony's 6 company. Serial entrepreneur like many, right? Anthony had also started this company called Replay TV. Anyone heard of Replay TV? Nope, because it doesn't exist anymore, right? Replay TV got squashed by lots of lawsuits, but Anthony got up, dusted himself off, and moved on. He had the wherewithal to say, yep, I've had my 5th failure now, my 5th failure, and I'm going to get up and I'm going to move on. What if everyone was like that? What if we didn't have the blame shame game? What if we said, yep, it's going to happen? By the way, I do know that there's a lot of banking people in here, so you'll excuse me if I'm promoting failure. I really don't mean to waste your money. But it's really important. So you've got Colombia, South America, you've got Gujarat in India, and you've got Silicon Valley in California. How is the Athens of Missouri, how is Columbia going to respond to failure in your local entrepreneur community? All right, so that takes us to our next slide, and changing our perspectives. We think failure is going to happen. We know it might happen. How do we get our heads around it? I've got three suggestions, one based on community, one based on your personal failures, and then one based on how you operationalize failure in your organization. He's been mentioned a million times before. Brad Feld, if I go to the next slide, in your community. Again, I can't say enough, as I get back into the entrepreneurial space, my local community in Minneapolis has been phenomenal, bouncing ideas off of. Lots of times I kind of heard it almost said verbatim, but you feel like you're walking into the fog, right, by yourself. Well, it doesn't have to be that way. You can actually engage that community, and I'd highly recommend it. But Brad had a great story a little while ago, and it made its way into his most recent book. And Brad had the story of, in Boulder, he was invited out for dinner by one of the VC groups. And he said, well, what's the deal? He said, we're having a wake. A wake? I don't even know this person. Like, no. It's a wake for our company that failed. And they went out to dinner and they celebrated. They celebrated that failure. They did it together. The young entrepreneurs who might have been crushed, who in Sarah's words, right, were thinking of themselves and, oh my God, I'm in the abyss. They picked themselves up and they said, no, we can actually do something about this. We can address this head on. We are going to cherish those failures, right? Brad's comment was, it's the community's way of showing these young, fragile entrepreneurs that it was okay to fail. The honor was in trying. So again, I ask you, what kind of community are you going to build? And slide. Okay. Here's another great one. The failure resume. Tina Selig out of Stanford's Technology Venture Portfolio Group. She teaches a class every year, and she has her students write a failure resume. Not a resume, a failure resume. Not about what your highlights, your accomplishments, or your successes, but your personal, your academic, and your professional failures. With each of those failures, then, you're expected to write down what you learned through that failure. Again, just a show of hands, how many people have actually gone to that length and written their own failure failure resume? Anybody? I got to tell you, it's cathartic. I've done it. I had a longer list than I would have liked, and I had a longer list than I thought. One of my best, most spectacular failures, as I mentioned to you, my degree from the University of Minnesota. Freshman fall quarter, I had a part-time job, I had the fraternity, I had Air Force ROTC, and I had, studies. I had a 1.2 GPA. 1.2. But what it taught me was that failure was not, it was my actions. That was me not studying. That was me maybe being at the fraternity a little too late, being out a little too long. That was my actions. But that failure did not define who I was. So what I do, like most of you who have failed in life, you pick yourself up, you dust yourself off, and you move on. And eventually, we were just talking about this at lunch today, success or failure is usually, when determining success or failure, you need to understand your time horizon, right? My time horizon was a 4-year degree, not a single quarter. Graduated, got a nice job, did everything well, but it was, again, going back to that, thinking back in that moment and how miserable I felt, how ashamed I felt, how, was I going to be able to pick myself up? And again, every one of you entrepreneurs has probably gone through the same thing. When you do your failure resume, think about this. Look at the list. How many things are on there? 0? Just a few? You might want to actually think about maybe you're not taking enough risk if you don't have enough in your failure resume. Okay. And then from an organization, I do understand there are some business people in here. I'll tell you a little bit about this story. This was at my last employer. 2007, I was shutting down a concept store that we had spent 2 years working on. Blood, sweat, tears, and not quite entrepreneurial. It wasn't my money at risk, but it was my effort, my time. And we were shutting this store down, and I had a colleague come up to me saying they were shutting down their work as well. And he was trying to figure out, what are you going to do next? Where do I go? And we talked about it a little bit, and he tells me this story, and it was amazing. They had learned so much. They had done so much. And I said, are you writing this story? Because he was told they had 60 days to find another job within the position and to either find another position or leave. And so what he had done was we had talked about it and said, are you writing this down? Are you going to tell your story? And the answer was no. And we're actually being discouraged from it. We're actually being discouraged from it? You just spent how many millions of dollars of the company's money, and you're not going to tell this story? And the reality was the executive who had sponsored the work didn't want the story told. And so I knew I wanted to tell my story. I wanted to tell the story of our concept store and the other projects. We said, if we get you a forum, will you tell your story? Talked about it with this partner, and they said, yeah, sure, we're probably out of here in 60 days anyway. And that was sort of the impetus for us to start what we termed the failure forums. I do have to recognize there was a senior vice president at the time. We're going to call it some fluffy thing like learning from challenge and change. He said, call it what it is. Call it failure. And I said, and I got that, remember that emotion I was telling you about a little bit earlier? I got it in my stomach. I'm like, oh, it is. It's a failure. It didn't accomplish the goal we set out. So we ended up running these failure forums for 2 years. And the good news is, or the bad news is, didn't really get any recognition for it. Didn't get a attaboy, keep going, right? Because most senior executives don't get to the C-suite based on their long list of failures. But I didn't get fired for it either. So I did have a few lessons that came out of it, though. If you're going to run something like that, it was an open forum, half an hour of half an hour of insight. What did you learn? What did you accomplish? What did you learn? And what would you have done different? And then a half an hour of Q&A. We kind of modeled it after TED Talks. Keep it brief, focus in. What did you accomplish? What did you learn? And what would you have done different? But we realized we needed executive sponsorship. So many people still at that point. We had run these for 2 years, and they're like, I'm not talking about it. It wasn't a failure in my books. And so, again, it was one of those programs where I've worked with other companies. It's a way to introduce failure into your organization. It's a way to talk about it. It doesn't have to be shoved under the rug or thrown in the closet and run in the opposite direction. So start at the top, and then stay away from blame statements if you're going to do those. They don't help. No one wants to talk about failures if you're going to start blaming. Let them come to that conclusion. And finally, back to Athens, the Athens of Missouri. I'm a big believer in the field of dreams, and I do think if you build it, they will come. By the way, I was speaking with someone this morning. Great stat on Wiki. You guys have one of the most highly educated populations in the entire country. 4 schools, or 4 universities, 4 hospitals. Again, you have the raw talent. People were talking about that earlier. You have resources to the east with St. Louis and the strong business community. You have resources to the west. Kauffman Foundation, again, I've got to meet Tom because what a great resource he's been in my career in helping push some of this thinking. And then you've got the Google Fiber Project where innovation is just going to be bubbling up. You are in sort of a sweet spot in my mind. Gandhi said it, be the change that you seek. Be the change that you seek. So, do you understand your fears? They're natural, they're normal, but they can be managed. What is your perspective? Colombia, South America, or Gujarat, or Silicon Valley? You have to define that as your own society. And then finally, back to my philosophy. What is your big idea? What is your big problem? Don't shelve your dream. Less risk. For those of you who raised your hand earlier today, were in your college years still, you have far less risk today than you ever will. Take this opportunity. And remember, you're not alone. And that's it. Thank you. Thank you.